Wars create many kinds of heroes. Some are remembered for the battles they won, others for the lives they saved. But history has rarely known a man whose greatest act of courage began with a decision no one could understand. In the autumn of 1940, as fear spread across occupied Poland, a new prison had begun swallowing people without explanation. Families watched loved ones disappear. Mothers waited for sons who never came home. Whispers escaped from behind barbed wire, but no one truly knew what was happening inside. Then one man made a decision that defied every instinct of survival. He would not run from the nightmare. He would walk straight into it, not because he wanted to die, but because someone had to uncover the truth and carry it back to the world. His name was Witold Pilecki, and this is the story of the man who volunteered for Auschwitz. Long before the world would know his name, before prison uniforms, before barbed wire, before history asked the impossible of him, Witold Pilecki was simply a man who loved his country. Born into a Poland struggling to reclaim its identity, Witold grew up believing that freedom was never guaranteed. It had to be defended by ordinary people willing to pay its price. As a young man, he answered the call to serve, not because he loved war, but because he loved peace enough to defend it. Those who knew him remembered someone steady, disciplined, thoughtful, the kind of man who never needed to announce his courage. It simply appeared whenever it was needed. Beyond the uniform was another side of Witold, a husband, a father, a landowner who found joy in the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. September 1939. Dawn had barely broken when the sound of war shattered the silence. Poland was under attack. Cities burned, roads filled with families carrying whatever they could hold. Soldiers fought with extraordinary courage, but against overwhelming force. For Witold Pilecki, surrender was never the end of the story. As Poland fell under occupation, he disappeared, but into resistance. Behind closed doors and in whispered meetings, a secret resistance began taking shape. Men and women began building a secret network determined to keep their nation alive. Every message carried, every meeting held, every act of defiance could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. Yet they continued, because some people understand that freedom can survive an invasion as long as courage survives in the hearts of ordinary people. Then the rumors began. A new German camp, prisoners disappearing behind its gates, almost no one returning. Those who escaped spoke in fragments, starvation, beatings, forced labor. But no one outside knew the full truth. The resistance needed answers. Someone had to go inside. Someone had to organize those imprisoned. Someone had to find a way to send the truth back to the outside world. It sounded impossible, which is why no one volunteered, until one man quietly raised his hand. Some of history's greatest acts of courage begin in complete silence. Few volunteers in history have ever accepted a mission like this. He would enter as a prisoner, live behind the barbed wire, build a secret resistance, discover the truth, and somehow carry it back to the outside world. They all knew what volunteering could mean: separation, suffering, almost certain death, which is why no one spoke. Then Witold Pilecki made his choice, not because he believed he could not die, but because he believed the truth could not be allowed to die with those trapped inside. At home, his wife and children had no idea history was asking more of him than any family should ever have to give. He could not promise he would return. He could not promise he would succeed. The only promise he could make was that if there was a path into the darkness, he would take it. Days later, he deliberately placed himself where German forces were carrying out mass arrests in Warsaw. There was no attempt to escape, no last-minute change of heart, only the quiet resolve of a man walking toward an uncertain future, with no guarantee he would ever return to everything he loved. The truck doors slammed shut, and with them, one ordinary life quietly disappeared into history. The truck slowed. The doors swung open. One command echoed through the air. Then, one foot touched the ground. To everyone watching, it was just another prisoner climbing from a crowded truck. But that single step carried the weight of a husband saying goodbye, a father leaving behind the laughter of his children, a free man surrendering his freedom, with no guarantee he would ever see any of them again. It landed like a thunderclap no one else could hear, because some footsteps do more than begin a journey. They divide a life into before and after. Iron gates, barbed wire, guard towers rising against the sky. For thousands who arrived here, hope ended at the entrance. For Witold Pilecki, the mission was only beginning. The camp wasted no time stripping away identity. Names became numbers. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear became daily companions. Every sunrise brought fear. Every night offered no certainty of another morning. The system was designed for one purpose: to convince every prisoner that they were no longer human. But there was one thing no guard could confiscate: conviction. Beneath the exhaustion and behind the silence, Witold watched. He listened. He remembered every face, every whispered name, every injustice, every fragment of truth, because the world outside could not fight what it did not know. And if he survived, someone would have to tell them. Each day demanded two things: survival and witness. If cruelty had built this place, then courage would quietly begin resisting it. Even here, days became weeks. Weeks became months. Hunger never loosened its grip. Fear never took a day off. Yet beneath the silence of Auschwitz, something remarkable was beginning to grow. One conversation, then another. Quiet nod, a whispered name, a prisoner willing to trust another prisoner. Carefully, patiently, Witold Pilecki began building a secret resistance from inside the camp. It wasn't built with weapons, it was built with trust. Men shared information, passed messages, and quietly carried one another's hope. They understood something their captors did not. A prison can chain a person's body, but it cannot chain people who refuse to stop believing in one another. Every new member brought new risk, one betrayal, one careless word, and everything could disappear overnight. Yet they continued, not because success was guaranteed, but because surrender would guarantee failure. The mission had never been survival alone. It was always about the truth. Week after week, Witold gathered another fragment of the truth. A new arrival, A missing prisoner, another act of cruelty, another life erased. Piece by piece, picture was emerging. The world had to see it, but between the truth and the outside world stood guards, barbed wire, and death. Still, the reports had to leave. Names were memorized, details carefully hidden. Messages passed through trusted hands. Every word carried beyond the fence was a victory. Every successful report meant the silence had been broken once more. But every report carried another question. Who had sent it? If the answer ever reached the guards, the underground resistance would vanish overnight. Yet Witold continued, not because the risk had grown smaller, but because the truth had grown larger. He understood something history would prove again and again. Evil survives most easily when the truth never leaves the room. So he kept sending it, one impossible act of courage at a time. Time moved differently inside Auschwitz. Days no longer measured life. They measured survival. Yet as the months passed, Witold Pilecki noticed something beyond the suffering. The camp was growing. More prisoners arrived. More lives disappeared. More reports were sent beyond the fences. But inside, very little changed. He had believed the truth would awaken the world. Instead, the world seemed painfully slow to awaken. That realization settled quietly upon him, not as despair, but as responsibility. If help would not come from outside, perhaps one day, those inside would have to resist together. The odds were overwhelming. Too few prisoners, too many guards, too many lives at stake. Yet extraordinary circumstances often give birth to extraordinary questions. Witold never confused hope with certainty. Hope did not guarantee success. It simply refused to surrender. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, the world continued turning. Inside Auschwitz, a prisoner quietly began preparing for possibilities no ordinary person should ever have to consider. Nearly 3 years had passed. Nearly 3 years of hunger, of whispered meetings, of smuggled reports, of watching courage survive where hope was meant to die. But something had changed. Witold Pilecki could see it. The mission inside Auschwitz had reached its limit. The resistance had been built. The reports had been sent. The truth had crossed the fences. Yet the help he had hoped for had not come. If the world was to understand what was happening, someone would have to tell the story face to face. That someone had to survive. Escape was not an act of self-preservation. It was the next stage of the mission. On a night in April 1943, opportunity finally appeared under the cover of darkness. Alongside 2 trusted companions, Witold slipped beyond the routine that had governed every hour of camp life. Every step invited discovery. Every sound carried danger. Behind them, guards, searchlights, barbed wire. Head, uncertainty. Freedom was still far away, but for the first time in years, the road no longer ended at a fence. By dawn, they had escaped, not because the danger was over, but because the mission had entered a new chapter. Freedom felt unfamiliar. After years behind barbed wire, even the open sky seemed different. But Witold Pilecki had not escaped to rest. He escaped to testify. The memories came with him, every face, every whispered name, every report, every life that had vanished behind the fences of Auschwitz. Now, he no longer wrote from inside the camp. He spoke as a witness. He described what he had seen. Not rumors, not second-hand accounts, but the testimony of a man who had lived through it. Some listened with disbelief. Others struggled to comprehend the scale of what he described. How could one place contain so much suffering? How could ordinary human beings create such extraordinary cruelty? Yet Witold never exaggerated. He didn't need to. The truth was already beyond imagination. Still, he refused to let silence reclaim what had already been spoken. If people doubted, he would speak again. If they questioned, he would answer. If they looked away, he would continue bearing witness. Because the voices of those who never left Auschwitz could no longer speak for themselves. So he carried them, not as a burden, but as a promise. The gates of Auschwitz were behind him, but peace was still nowhere to be found. Witold Pilecki returned to a world still consumed by war. His reports had become part of history, but history itself was still being written. He rejoined the struggle, not because he hungered for battle, but because freedom was still unfinished work. In 1944, as Warsaw rose against Nazi occupation, he fought once again. Street by street, building by building, alongside ordinary men and women who believed their country was worth defending. The cost was devastating. The city bled. Friends fell. Homes disappeared beneath smoke and fire. Yet even in defeat, Witold remained what he had always been, a servant, never chasing glory, never seeking recognition, only asking one question: what does duty require of me now? The war in Europe finally drew to a close. The Nazi regime had fallen. Millions celebrated. Surely, the long night was over. But for Poland, dawn would not arrive as expected. One occupation had ended. The war had ended. The guns had grown quieter. Across Europe, people began rebuilding lives that war had nearly destroyed. But Poland's future remained uncertain. One occupying power had fallen. Another now tightened its grip. Many believed peace had finally arrived. Witold saw something different. He saw fear changing its uniform. Once again, he was asked to serve, not on a battlefield, but in the shadows. He gathered information, quietly, carefully, faithfully, reporting on the new communist authorities and the reality unfolding in post-war Poland. Friends urged him to leave, to disappear, to save himself while he still could. After everything he had survived, no one would have blamed him. He had already given more than enough. But duty had never been something Witold measured by convenience. It was measured by conscience. Then, the knock finally came. He was arrested, not by the regime he had risked his life to resist in Auschwitz, but by the new authorities ruling the country he loved. The interrogations began. The prison walls closed around him once more. Beatings, isolation, endless pressure to confess to crimes he had never committed. Yet those who questioned him discovered the same man the Nazis had failed to break. They could imprison his body. They could wound his flesh. but they could not persuade him to betray the truth he had spent his life defending. Once again, freedom had been taken from him, but dignity remained untouched. The prison cell was quiet, not because justice had been done, but because truth had once again become dangerous. Witold Pilecki had survived Auschwitz. He had survived war. He had survived the collapse of one tyranny, only to stand before another. His trial offered little justice. Its verdict had been written long before the courtroom gathered. Yet even there, he remained what he had always been: calm, steadfast, faithful to his conscience. He could have chosen an easier path years before. He could have stayed away from Auschwitz. He could have fled Poland after the war. He could have chosen safety over service. Again and again, he chose duty. On May 25, 1948, his life was taken. He was 47 years old. Those who ordered his death believed they were silencing a man. They did not realize they were entrusting him to history. For years, his name was spoken only in whispers, his story hidden, his sacrifice buried beneath fear. But truth has remarkable patience. It waits, it endures, and eventually finds its voice again. Today, we remember Witold Pilecki not because he died. We remember him because he lived, because when fear demanded silence, he chose truth. When hatred demanded surrender, he chose courage. When history asked, "Who will go?" he quietly answered, "I will." History rarely asks most of us to do what it asked of Witold Pilecki. Few will ever be called to walk willingly into a place like Auschwitz, but every generation is asked a quieter question. When truth becomes inconvenient, when courage becomes costly, when doing the right thing asks something of us, who will we choose to be? History may never ask you to do what Witold Pilecki did, but it may ask you to tell the truth, to stand when it's difficult, or to choose conscience over convenience. When that moment comes, may you remember the man who quietly answered, "I will, until I come your way again." May this story remind you that even in life's hardest moments, strength can still be found. This is the power of pain, where broken stories become unbreakable strength. Thank you for watching.